In this lecture from History 122, World Civilizations from 1600, we will be covering Section 10, the Second World War. Our objectives for this section, we will try and see what happened when weak liberal democracies failed to deal with the difficult problems of the 1920s and 1930s and the problematic peace after the Great War, otherwise known as World War I. We will examine how World War II broke out and how it ended and why. We will also try and understand how World War II was a war for resources. And we will also try and complicate the idea of World War II as a good war. There's a tendency to kind of look back and say, well, this was a good war in which good versus evil and so forth. And while I do think that the Nazis and the Japanese Empire were definitely a force for evil, that doesn't mean that there weren't other problems from the side of the Allies, and we'll deal with that. And in particular, we'll raise moral questions about the nature of war, particularly total war. Now, in the previous sections, we had been talking about the rise of communism and other alternate roads to modernity. In a sense, you can understand World War II as a battle between three isms. There's going to be three major isms that are going to be struggling for predominance in the world. We've talked a lot about capitalist liberal democracy. Remember, when we talk about liberalism and capitalism, we don't mean necessarily the Democratic Party. We're talking about governments like the United States and Great Britain and France. We also have talked about communism. That's the second major ideology that is struggling for supremacy. I now have to introduce the third ideology that's going to be part of this struggle for ideological supremacy as people try and figure out what is the best way to be modern. And that ideology is fascism, right? That ideology is fascism. There is a good chance that you have not heard of fascism, or if you have, you're maybe not quite sure what it is, because unfortunately now it is used as a insult. So, for example, during the presidency of President George Bush Jr., there were people who called him a fascist, and this always drove me nuts because he's not a fascist. You can criticize someone's political beliefs, but you need to use the correct terms. Because as we'll see clearly, President Bush was not a fascist. He was a big believer in liberal democracy and thought that it could be exported relatively easily, but he was not a fascist. He believed in liberal democracy. So then, fascism is based on a Roman word, fasces. And these are two Roman statues holding fasces. So you see how on the left there is a woman with a axe, and surrounding the axe on her lap is a bundle of rods. And you can see something similar of this other woman holding on the right. Those are the fasces. The fasces represented authority in the Roman Empire. If you carried those, that meant that you had some kind of authority in particular, to punish. Right? So it's a symbol of power, and it focuses on this idea that you can use violence to punish, to enforce justice. Right? It's not violence for the sake of violence. The idea is that if we want justice, we need a kind of strong authority that can wield violence correctly in order to help bring justice to society. And rods were used to beat people who were committed crimes. Axes, of course, were used to cut off people's heads if they committed a really bad crime. So when you see the fasces, you think of power and authority. Right? When you see the fasces, you think of power and authority. In particular, in the time period, it was understood to mean justice. On the right is the United States Tax Court. It also has the fasces, and that's kind of scary because it's kind of threatening violence if you don't pay your taxes, but the government is serious. Pay your taxes. So the ideology of fascism finds its roots, in a sense, in this Roman idea, this Roman symbol of the fasces, which were, like I said, symbols of authority, of power, particularly the power to do justice. Now, unfortunately, fascism will not care much about justice. It will, however, care about authority and power. So what then is fascism? And remember, fascism is one of the three ideologies, in a sense, that are going to be at war during World War II, the other two being capitalist liberal democracy, liberalism, and communism. So in fascism, these are what I would say are the characteristics. And like I said, it's important to understand these characteristics. That's why I get annoyed when people will call someone a fascist who doesn't meet these characteristics. This is an actual ideology, and we need to be aware of its existence, though it's not particularly popular today. And we shouldn't use the term just as an insult. It actually means something. So, first of all, one aspect of fascism is the idea of a mass political party centered around a dynamic, charismatic leader. Right? So you have a mass political party centered around a dynamic, charismatic leader. So you have a political party in which a lot of people belong to it. And it's not so much that it's centered around abstract ideas, but around a leader who is charismatic. And by that, I mean people are attracted to this person. They think this person's awesome and brilliant and a genius. And this party wants to establish a party state with the leader at its head. Right? So it's interested in establishing a one-party state. They only want one political party to be in existence, their party led by this charismatic leader. And so that means the state also centers around the leader, right? The idea of fascism is that you should have a state governed by one political party, and that political party is gathered and centered around one charismatic leader. So thus, the party state is also centered around the leader. In addition, fascism emphasizes nationalism. We may even call it a kind of ultranationalism. Nationalists can often respect each other. So, for example, I studied Korea, and Koreans tend to be very nationalistic, and they respect Americans who are also patriotic. So the idea being that they understand that this is a virtue that people of a country should have, right? Patriotism in a sense. But fascist, their typical view is that their nation state is just better than everyone else's, and they're just awesome, and everyone else is, in a sense, below them. Other nations are inferior to them. In addition, because communism theoretically destroys nationalism, we can see that there were communists who were also nationalists, like Mao Zedong. However, because communism theoretically destroys nationalism, it threatens nationalism. Remember, communism says that your first loyalty is to your class. Nationalism says your first loyalty should be to your nation. Fascism is therefore anti-communist because fascists put such an emphasis on the nation. Anything that competed for loyalty with the nation was bad. In addition, fascism is authoritarian and totalitarian. What do I mean by that? Authoritarian has the word authority in it. Basically, the government tells you what to do, and you do it. Right? That's an authoritarian style of government. It's not a kind of democracy where you negotiate with the government, where you're kind of you can phone up your congressman or congresswoman and say, hey, I don't like this policy, or I support this policy, please vote for it. No, the government tells you what to do, and you do it. And we call it totalitarian because it argued that it had the legitimacy to exercise its authority all throughout society, right? It had its authority, to exercise its authority all throughout society. There was no place where the government was not allowed to go. So, for example, I don't hear people say this recently, but I've heard in the past where people have said in American political debates, hey, the government has no right to tell two consenting adults what they do in the privacy of their own bedroom. Fascism says, of course, the government has every business in being concerned what people do in their bedrooms. And in particular, fascist countries wanted people to be having lots and lots of babies, but they wanted them to be the right kind of people. So to give you an example, and you may be saying, geez, doesn't this sound a lot like Nazi Germany? You're correct. Nazism is a kind of fascism. And in Nazi Germany, women who were of the correct racial type, women who were not Jewish, but who were considered good Aryan women, if these women had a lot of babies, they were awarded by the state. They would be given, and it's almost like a kind of Olympics. Women who had a certain number of babies would be given actual bronze medals by the government. Women who got more babies would be given silver, and women who had like the most babies would be given gold. But see, you can see the government is saying, we do have business in telling you what to do in the bedroom, and we want you to be having lots and lots of children. So it's an authoritarian, totalitarian government that claims it can tell you what to do pretty much everywhere. Now, what's striking about this, though, not only is this not obviously this is not a liberal system, right? You can see that this is very different from liberalism, from democracy and things like that. In some ways it accepts capitalism, but in other ways it has socialism. Basically, in there's socialist elements in which the government exercises control over the economy, right? There's socialist elements in which the government exercises control over the economy. And the idea is that the government wants to make the economy serve the good of the nation. So again, I already kind of let the cat out of the bag. I told you this is Nazism is kind of fascism. Hitler referred, in a sense, to Nazi ideas as National Socialism, right? Socialism, control of the economy by the government in order to help make a strong nation state. That's the idea. And there's this emphasis on strength and the militarization of society, right? You can kind of see this as a very hierarchical system. And so it kind of goes well with a military mindset because, of course, the army is all about hierarchy, right? You have officers who tell people what to do, the enlisted men and women, and they are supposed to do it. And you can see that in particular in this poster here, right? This is a political poster supporting fascism. And it's really striking in a sense, right? Because that's not what I think of when I think of a democratic poster, right? I mean, the guy's got a gun. And look at those arms. I mean, this guy is tough, and he's got a flag behind him with a skull on it, right? And like I said, this isn't the pirate party. It looks kind of like a pirate flag. It's a fascist party. And fascists emphasize strength, especially military strength. And in a sense, they want to make society like a military, right? So you've got this government which wants to, which is, like I said, is authoritarian, totalitarian, centered around a dynamic, charismatic leader, kind of like a general in a sense, who then commands society and controls society with the idea, including the economy, with the idea of making a strong society and a strong nation state. Now, one thing you may have noticed about that poster, if you know German or Italian, was that that poster was not in German, it was in Italian. And it's important to stress, even though when we think of fascism, we often think of the Nazis, the person who actually developed fascism first was the Italian Benito Mussolini, right? It was the Italian Benito Mussolini. So, and I will most likely ask this on a test, so do keep it in mind. Hitler is not the inventor of fascism. It was Benito Mussolini. So this is also kind of strange. Italy is a little bit like Japan. Remember how we talked about how Japan was on the side of Britain and France and the United States in World War I, but would fight those countries in World War II. Italy is similar, right? Italy will be on the side of France and Britain in World War I, and will switch sides to be on the side of Germany and fight against France and Britain in World War II. So we have to kind of explain why that happens, and it's kind of similar to Japan. A lot of the problems are economic. Post-war Italy, immediately after the war, did not go through like a boom time when everything was great. It's not like the United States, right? The United States, you know, we talk about the Roaring '20s as being this kind of time of, economic progress and hope. It wasn't like that in Italy. Italy, even though it had been on the side of the Allies, came out worse than it had been before the war, right? The war was not good to Italy, and Italy was plunged in economic and social chaos. And in that chaos, there rose to power a man named Benito Mussolini, who himself was a veteran and had been a socialist. And he is going to build a mass party and pioneer this idea of fascism, of what we might call National Socialism. Socialism organized not for the good of the, in a sense of a small community or the good of the workers, but for the good of the nation, right? The good of the nation. And the thing about this movement is it's very attractive to veterans, right? Remember how I said that in fascism there's this kind of militarization of society? We look back at World War I and we say, wow, this was a terrible war. And it was a terrible war. I don't want to play that down. Lots of people died, lots of people suffered. But the experience of going through that terrible war together really made veterans close to each other and gave them a sense of meaning. And the military, for a lot of people, gave them a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. So many veterans were attracted to fascism, right? It was this kind of hierarchical system, similar to the army, in which you were given orders or gave orders, and those orders are supposed to be obeyed. There's no real negotiation. And this was attractive to many veterans. And especially if you're a veteran, you feel frustrated. You fought in a war, you maybe lost buddies in the war, and your reward for your sacrifice is a government that can't seem to get you a job after the war. and there seems to be lots and lots of social chaos. So lots of veterans will be attracted to this system. Benito Mussolini will organize these veterans and actually lead a march on Rome in 1922. Rome is the capital of Italy, and he will just have his men march there. All these followers, many of whom are veterans and are familiar with how to use violence. And the Italian government isn't sure what to do about this, right? These guys are all marching on Rome. It's not clear to what purpose, but it's clear they do want power. They can't call out the army to fight the veterans because that A, will look really bad, like firing on veterans, and B, the army might not do it, right? The army might say, we have more in common with these veterans. A lot of us fought in the war. We're sympathetic to fascism and Mussolini's ideas, and so we're not going to be on your side. So what the government did when Mussolini will march on Rome with a lot of his followers is to appoint him prime minister, right? They're going to try and bring him into the government with the idea that maybe then they can control him. But they are completely wrong. In 1924, he will seize complete power and become dictator of Italy. And what's key then, this model can be exported, and it will certainly be exported to Germany. So dealing with Adolf Hitler is very difficult. He's kind of depicted typically in popular culture as just this crazy guy. And I think that's a problem. I would argue that Adolf Hitler was a genius, but an evil genius. Crazy people actually aren't that harmful. They can't actually do that much damage because they're crazy. They're essentially irrational. But Adolf Hitler had a kind of evil rationality. His reasoning was not always based on correct principles, but he was rational. And he was really smart, and he was very evil. And I think it's very important for us to make this clear, because if we don't, we can't really learn anything, right? If we just say, well, Hitler did bad things because he was crazy, well, I'm not crazy, so I'm not going to do bad things. That's the kind of logic that can come out of that. No, Hitler was not crazy. He was evil. And that should be a warning to us about the evil that we might do, right? If we just dismiss Hitler and say, oh, I'm nothing like Adolf Hitler, I can never be as bad as him. Well, we might not be as bad as him, but that's setting the bar really low, right? We are all capable of evil, I would argue, and we're very good at trying to justify our evil. So it's important to look at Hitler as, like I said, an evil genius, as someone who was able to come up with persuasive arguments that convinced people that evil was just fine. And if we want to be able to oppose evil, we need to be able to understand this kind of thinking and be able to show where it's faulty. So, that being said, we need to understand a little bit about Adolf Hitler's background. The picture on the right is of a younger Adolf Hitler when he was in World War I. Adolf Hitler served in World War I. What's kind of interesting, by the way, is he was an Austrian, but actually served in the German army, and he understood Austria and Germany as basically the same thing, that they were all ethnic Germans, so it didn't really matter which country they were from. So he was a veteran, and the thing is, before the war, Hitler was just, he was a painter who couldn't really find work. And I mean, like, he painted like landscapes and things like that. And he was just this kind of ne'er-do-well who couldn't really find his place in society. And when war broke out, it was actually good for Hitler, because Hitler found himself in the military and he liked it. He liked the direction. He liked the meaning. He liked the comradeship. So it's really bizarre, because we tend to emphasize how World War II had a really negative impact on a lot of people. For many reasons, Hitler actually enjoyed serving in the military. And he, in a sense, like Mussolini and the veterans who followed Mussolini, is inspired by this kind of vision of a militarized society and this idea of combining nationalism and socialism in order to serve the nation. Right? You had this kind of military, authoritarian command of society to serve the nation. And in particular, one reason he was attracted to it was he thought that that would help Germany restore its national honor and glory after the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. Right? He thought that this would restore this. Right? This was the method. How are we going to, we had to sign this humiliating treaty. How are we going to overcome that treaty and become a powerful country and gain international respect again, right? How can we do that? And his answer was National Socialism, was this fascism pioneered by Mussolini. Now, one thing I have to stress, too, Hitler did understand the military, and he understood this kind of the fact, or rather I should say he knew the fact that Germany had lost the war even though it had troops in France, and that no Allied army had actually invaded Germany successful. And so what's key is he looked back and argued that the reason Germany lost was because the army had been betrayed by weak politicians, particularly Jewish people. Right, so he argued that Germany would have won World War I if the civilians would have not been so weak, and if they did not have the kind of what he understood as the contagion of Judaism. And one thing we'll talk about, Hitler doesn't view Judaism as a religion, but as a race, which is really weird, but we'll get back to that shortly. But the key thing was he blamed the loss in World War I on weak civilian populations and Jews. Everyone but the army, essentially, he thought was at fault. So he wanted to build a strong army in which the army was in command, in a sense, of society, or at least was the major interest in society, a militarized society, and that would be able to fix everything. Now, so Hitler is going to launch a coup attempt in 1923. He's been organizing this political party, the Nazis, and he's going to launch a failed coup attempt in 1923. I'm not too strict on years, but do notice that Mussolini was able to launch his March on Rome and be appointed prime minister in 1922. So Adolf Hitler was clearly taking a page out of Mussolini's book, right? He was looking to Mussolini and trying to imitate him. However, Hitler's coup attempt will fail, right? Hitler's coup attempt will fail. And in a sense, the guy should have been shot. He tried to overthrow the government. That's treason. And people died when he tried to overthrow the government. I mean, that's essentially murder. But the judge was actually kind of sympathetic to Adolf Hitler, and so just threw him in jail. And not even for that long, just a few years. And while Hitler was in jail, he's going to write a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. And one thing I want to emphasize is when Hitler talks about struggling, he's not just thinking in terms of just like a personal conflict. He's thinking of a kind of Darwinian or social Darwinian struggle for survival, right? So when you think my struggle, think struggles for survival, think social Darwinism. Now, the problem with trying to understand Adolf Hitler was the guy was a consummate liar. He was like really, really good at lying and tricking people. And so it's really difficult when he says something to say, oh, that's what Hitler really believed, especially because he will contradict himself at times. He will say different things to different people based on whatever he thinks will help him the most. So the guy lied all the time. So it's very difficult to actually figure out what he thought. I think, though, that in Mein Kampf, he was being relatively honest. And the reason I think that is because when you look at the ideas of Mein Kampf and you look at how Hitler behaved, not his words, but his actions, they're congruent, right? Mein Kampf, his book, his ideas in that book, help explain how he acts later. So I think that he's being relatively honest in this book. If we want to understand what Hitler really thought, I think he does a pretty good job in this book of explaining it. So first of all, Hitler believed in social Darwinism. He believed that human races were locked in a struggle for existence, that there were superior races and inferior races, and the superior races, by the virtue of their superiority, should be in charge of the world. He also believed in National Socialism, which we've mentioned before, but just to emphasize, in which the government controls the economy for the good of the nation. Now, for Americans, we understand the American nation is a multi-ethnic nation. People of African descent, people of European descent, people of Asian descent, people from Mexico or Guatemala or wherever are all considered equal. They are all equal parts of the American nation. We have what's called a civic understanding of the nation, typically based around citizenship and the belief in the principles of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that sort of thing. But for Nazis, German citizenship did not make you a member of the nation. What made you a member of the nation was having the correct race, and that was understood in purely biological terms. and as I said before, Jewish people will be excluded from this understanding of the nation because Judaism is understood to be a result, or to be racial rather than religious. This is why, for example, the Nazis would oppress Christians who were Jews who had converted to Christianity, right? So if you were a Jewish person who became a Christian, Nazis didn't care. They would still come after you because Judaism for them was a race. Now, so the Germans then believed that the Nazi ideology held that Germans were part of a pure Aryan race. Other members could be found in other places, such as in Northern Europe. And as this pure Aryan race is the master race, they should rule the world, right? They should rule the world. Might makes right. So they should rule the world. Now, they understood that they were threatened by internal and external enemies. Remember, I mentioned that Mein Kampf is called, it means my struggle. Who is Hitler struggling against? Internal, external enemies. Who are the internal enemies? Jews. He saw the Jewish people as fundamentally non-German and is acting only for their own interests, and that they were the ones who fundamentally betrayed the German army during World War I. The German army had not been defeated, but Jewish traitors and weak civilian politicians had agreed to the armistice, and if it weren't for them, everything would have been fine. Similarly, unfit people, remember social Darwinism, are seen as terrible, as bad, as weighing down society. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And you can kind of see this as an example of scapegoating. One thing that human beings like to do, unfortunately, and this is what I mean, is that we need to learn lessons from Hitler, rather than blame ourselves, rather than saying, oh, the reason the German army lost in World War I was because of some mistakes the German army made, rather than doing that, Hitler just blamed other people. So one thing we like to do, especially if we're a group that holds power, is we like to blame other people for our problems. And we can do that because we're the group that holds power, right? So, why do we have problems? Well, it's this unpopular minority. It's great to blame an unpopular minority because you don't have to deal with your own problems. And what's an unpopular minority going to do? They're the minority. How are they going to fight back? Right? So this is just an unfortunate human tendency, right? We like to blame our problems on people who can't defend themselves. That way we don't have to really take responsibility for our mistakes. And, people who can't defend themselves can't fight back. Now, the external enemy for Hitler was communism. We've kind of talked about this already, how there's this idea that Nazi ideology, fascist ideology focuses on how we should be loyal to the nation first. Remember, they follow ultranationalism. Communists theoretically argue we should focus on class first. So he saw communism as a great external enemy, though strikingly enough, he also tried to make communism racial by arguing that it was essentially a kind of Slavic ideology. So it's interesting. Hitler likes to take things that aren't racial and try and make them racial and biological. It's kind of curious. But basically what Hitler wanted to do was destroy these inferior people or enslave them, and then take their land and their resources, particularly food and oil, so there could be an expansion of this great master race. Adolf Hitler saw Germans as the master race, but they were plagued by internal enemies, threatened on the outside by external enemies. They needed to destroy those enemies so they could take their rightful place in the world. Might makes right, of course. And then they could get the resources they needed to thrive as this master race and as masters of the world.